Welcome to Crosspoint.
Welcome to Crosspoint.
Welcome to Crosspoint.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition
that's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious.
That we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family.
Regardless of race, age, creed,
physical abilities, marital or economic status,
gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
if you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
if you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
I will build my house, whether storm or drought, on the rock that does not move. I will set my hope in your love, oh Lord, and your faithfulness will prove that you are steadfast. Steadfast
by the word you spoke, all the starry hosts are called out by name each night. In your watchful care, I will rest secure as you lead us with your light.
'Cause you are steadfast, steadfast. You are steadfast, steadfast. I will not trust in the strength of kings. On your promise I will stand. I will shout for joy, I will raise my voice, hallelujah to the Lamb. You are steadfast, steadfast. You are steadfast, steadfast.
In the moment of emptiness, all was fulfilled. In the hour of darkness, your light was revealed. In the presence of death, your life was affirmed. In the absence of holiness, you are still God.
You are steadfast, steadfast. You are steadfast, steadfast. You are steadfast, steadfast. in the garden of my Savior. No flower grows unseen. His kindness rains like water on every humble seed. No tender act of mercy escapes his watchful eye. For there is one who loves me. His hand is over mine. In the kingdom of the heavens, no suffering is unknown. Each tear that falls is holy. Each breaking heart a throne. There is a song of beauty in every weeping eye. For there is one who loves me. His heart, it breaks with mine. The table of our Savior, no mouths will go unfed. His children in the shadows stream in and raise their heads. Oh, give us ears to hear them, and give us eyes to see. For there is one who loves them. I am his hands and feet.
There are many ways we collaborate with each other to be the church we're called to be and to serve how we serve. And our contributing financially is one of the most important of those ways. If you want to help fund and sustain what we get to do together, go to crosspoint.org/contribute to see the many simple ways that you can do so. You can even text Crosspoint NC to 77977 to receive a link to get started now. Thank you for your partnership in the work we do together.
Good morning, Crosspoint. So today I want to talk with you about several different things. I want to talk with you about Twitter, witches, because, Halloween, of course, this weekend, 70s TV sitcoms, 10th century history, why the Bible is cooler than you probably think it is, and what that all has to do with how we live out faith now. And so just to say it up front, we're going to swim in some fairly deep biblical scholarship waters today that I frankly wouldn't typically try to nerd out on in a weekend teaching, but I just felt like today that it was appropriate. But first, let's start with Twitter. Little over a year ago, I posted this one afternoon. I once had a friend who lost $22 million at the casino one afternoon. That same night, he won $9 million at the casino. Clearly, my friend is the best gambler ever because he won $9 million in one night. Amazing. Now, I know you're probably thinking, with profound content like that, I don't understand why Jonathan doesn't have more followers on Twitter. Exactly. And I get it, right? It doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. And if you were to look back over my profile of very few tweets over the past few years, I don't tweet very often, but it would seem to be pretty random. But I want you to see another post that was made by the vice president at that time, Mike Pence. And if you look at the timestamp, it was less than 24 hours earlier that he wrote this. We've created more jobs in the last 3 months than Joe Biden and Barack Obama created in their 8 years in office. Now, before you think I'm getting too partisan here, just hang with me for a second. Both Republican and Democratic politicians manipulate these kind of talking points all the time, whichever way causes their preferred interest to appear in a more favorable light. This is just the example I used that day. And to be clear, I've publicly critiqued both the last administration and this current administration on specific issues. So don't assume I have some other agenda until you just hear me all the way out here. But the reality is, when this statement was made, the U.S. economy had lost 22 million jobs since the beginning of the pandemic. And in my opinion, that would have happened in to some similar degree, regardless of which partisan group was in charge at the time. But 6 months into the pandemic, when this statement was made by the vice president, it is true that the U.S. economy had successfully reemployed 9 million of those jobs in the previous 3 months. But it is also true that we were still 13 million jobs in the hole from where we started. And so the idea that one would claim we've created more jobs in the past 3 months than the previous administration did in their 8 years is an incredibly misleading, if not flat out ridiculous statement. So I found myself frustrated at that type of manipulative political jargon, which again is used by both sides of the political aisle all the time, continues to take advantage of people and arm them with talking points to be used as weapons against others when it's all just a lie. And so I gave myself a night to sleep on it, and then the next day I posted this. I once had a friend who lost $22 million at the casino one afternoon. That same night, he won $9 million at the casino. Clearly, my friend is the best gambler ever because he won $9 million in one night. Amazing. And so in a sense, I told my own little parable as a critique of the current events that were happening at the time. But if one wasn't following the current political news of the time, it would make complete sense that they may just think, that's just random and weird. I don't get what in the world is he trying to say. What's the point? And then imagine someone else reading it several years, decades, or centuries from now without the awareness of what was going on politically at the time that I wrote it. A lot about the intent would be missed. Now, the thing is, this type of storytelling isn't new, right? Take the classic 1953 play, The Crucible, written by Arthur Miller. In the play, Miller dramatizes and gives a partially fictional account of the real Salem witch trials that took place in the 1690s. But the play wasn't actually about the Salem witch trials that had happened 300 years earlier. Instead, Miller's actual intentions were to critique realities in his own current circumstances in the 1950s, specifically McCarthyism, when the U.S. government went on a witch hunt of sorts for communists that they believe had infiltrated American soil, making all sorts of wild accusations and persecuting people for being communist or being sympathizers to communists. And so Arthur Miller himself had been accused and had experienced that persecution firsthand. And so he wrote this play, The Crucible, as a critique on McCarthyism. But he did so using the events of the Salem witch trials as an allegory from 300 years prior to that. Perhaps more familiar to some of you would be the movie and the subsequent TV series MASH that kicked off in 1969, where the movie tells the story of American troops during the Korean War set in the 50s. But for all those who know and love the show, they know it's offering commentary on another war, the Vietnam War, the one that was taking place when it was written and shown starting in 1969. We also see Shakespeare use the same type of literary device in some of the storytelling that he does, and countless others do this throughout history. And so what I want to suggest to you today is that there's strong evidence that the storytelling in Genesis, the first book of the Bible, often functions in much of the same way. Now, much of what I want to share with you today is based off the research of a university professor named Gary Rinsberg. He currently teaches at Rutgers University, but he was also at Cornell for 18 years. He's got a doctorate in Hebrew studies, is an expert in biblical scholarship, the Hebrew language, and ancient Judaism. And almost 20 years ago, he gave a talk on his research. You can still find it online. And most of what I'll share next comes from his research. A little bit comes from another biblical expert, Peter Enns, who many of you know. He's a friend of Crosspoint. And then I'm going to throw in some of my own thoughts and observations along the way, especially when it gets to why I think this matters to you and I today. Because again, even though it may require us to swim in kind of nerdy biblical scholarship waters for a bit, I really do think at the end it can be helpful. So let's start by establishing some of the context for Genesis. The general consensus among biblical scholars is that Genesis was written during the monarchy of Israel, highlighted by the reigns of people like King David, King Saul, King Solomon. And this period of Israelite kings ruling from Jerusalem lasted about 400 years, from around 1000 BCE to 600 BCE. This reign of the monarchy came to an end right after 600 BCE when the Babylonians invaded and conquered Jerusalem and the Israelite people went into exile, basically enslaved to the Babylonians for about 70 years, until they returned to Jerusalem after being set free in the 530s BCE. And so, what many scholars like Rinsberg suggest is that Genesis is offering commentary on the monarchy, Genesis likely being written while the monarchy is still alive and active, and some other portions of Genesis probably being written after the monarchy has fallen, and it's giving commentary on the monarchy. And the argument goes that the monarchy was the pinnacle of Israel's story, that it was at the height of Israel's power and influence, having gone on this journey from being slaves in Egypt to wandering in the desert to establishing themselves as a nation and becoming this powerful monarchy in the world, to then seeing it collapse and being enslaved again to Babylon, to eventually returning to Jerusalem. These authors of Genesis find themselves wrestling with, how did we get here? These Israelites, these Hebrews, wondering, how did we get here when they're at the very height of their power, from this days of slavery in Egypt? And then at other points, you've got authors wrestling with, how did we screw this all up? When we thought we had arrived, when we thought we had made it and we're on top of the world, how did we get to this humbled position we find ourselves in after looking back and seeing that it all collapsed? I often compare it to the Star Wars saga, where you have the original movies, which we all know are the best, right? But afterwards, you've had people wrestling with, okay, well now, we're interested in how did we get here? What's the backstory to all of this? And thus, like in Star Wars, the prequels were born. And Genesis works kind of like that. It's going back and providing a backstory to try to help explain how they got to where they are in this current moment. But Rinsberg argues that just like the Crucible and MASH and some works of Shakespeare, that Genesis is offering commentary on present-day issues clothed in stories from the past. It's speaking to the monarchy and commenting on the author's present-day reality while using these ancient stories that had been passed down to do it. So, just to be clear, I'm not suggesting this is the only way to see it. There's lots of different ways you can see it. But I want you to see how this framework plays itself out and see if it perhaps is helpful to you. So let's take the story of Adam, from the very beginning of Genesis. In suggests that rather than seeing Adam as the account of the first human being, what if we think of Adam's story as a condensed version of Israel's entire saga? So consider the parallels of the two stories. You've got Adam, right? Created by God out of the dust of the earth and placed into this lush paradise, the Garden of Eden. And God gives Adam a command to follow. Don't eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And Adam, if you do, you're going to die. Well, Adam does end up eating from the tree. But rather than being struck down dead, what we find is Adam and Eve are driven out of the lush paradise. They're exiled from the land that they were given. But what about when we read that story of Adam? What about when we read the word Adam, we think Israel? Because consider Israel's story. The people of Israel were birthed out of the dust of slavery in Egypt, where God had delivered them and placed them in a promised land that they called Canaan, this lush paradise that's described in the Bible as a land flowing with milk and honey. God gives the Israelites the 10 commandments, the laws of Moses, and they're told, if you obey these commands and you will stay in the land and thrive in it. But if you disobey, you're going to be exiled from the land, which is exactly what happens to Israel. An interesting side note, in at least 2 different places in the Old Testament, Israel's exile from the land is referred to as a death, just like Adam's exile is referred to as a death. Because Adam doesn't really die when he eats the fruit, even though that says what the punishment's going to be, but rather he gets exiled. Again, that's what happens to Israel. And so from the opening pages of Genesis, we're given some clues with Adam's story and some rather striking parallels that Genesis could very well be addressing Israel's journey as a people and as a nation. And again, the pinnacle of that is the monarchy, and specifically King David. Now, there's several different examples that we could explore, but I want to try to look at just one story that we find in Genesis chapter 38. Because as you read through Genesis, it kind of comes out of nowhere. There's this long epic story toward the end of Genesis of a man named Joseph, the one with the coat of many colors. And the story of Joseph gets dramatically interrupted with another story that we find in Genesis chapter 38. And then the story of Joseph just continues on like nothing ever happened. It just gets inserted in this pretty random place. And it's this thing that happens rather abruptly inside this existing narrative. And it feels like it's put there to make sure to draw attention to it because it's so abruptly placed. Now, if you want to read the whole story, feel free to read it on your own. You can go to Genesis chapter 38 and read through the whole story. But here's the general summary. There's a man named Judah. And it says he marries a woman, but it doesn't give her name. It only describes her as the daughter of Shua. They go on to have children together, and their oldest son is given a wife named Tamar. Now, as the story goes, this oldest son, husband of Tamar, was evil in the eyes of the Lord, and so it says the Lord put him to death. And so Tamar was given another one of Judah's sons. But he too was found to be evil in the eyes of the Lord, and so the Lord put him to death as well. And so it's important to understand the ancient context here, that Tamar has next to no rights here. She was given to this man as a spouse. He dies, given to his brother. He dies. And so now she's just kind of put in this limbo. And without a husband, without any children, she's got no place of security in the family. She's got no security for her own livelihood. She could easily be viewed as expendable and damaged goods. And who knows the different myths and rumors that were floating around about her, about why these men died. Judah says to Tamar, okay, go live as a widow in my father's household. And then when my youngest son is old enough, I will give him to you to be his wife. But in essence, again, this just kind of leaves her in this middle ground because she's promised to this future son. Because she's promised him, Tamar can't engage in any other relationships. And yet she still has no security for her own livelihood. She's basically a slave. Well, over the course of many years, it became clear that Judah had no intention of ever giving Tamar to his youngest son, even long after he had grown up. And so Tamar takes her future into her own hands. Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. And after Judah had taken some time to grieve, Judah, who was a shepherd, goes on a business trip of sorts with a friend named Hira to check on the sheep in a nearby town. So he leaves the town of Adullam, where he and his family were living, and he goes on this trip. Well, Tamar hears about this business trip of Judah's, And so she goes and disguises herself and dresses up like a prostitute and sits down at the entrance to this other town. When Judah sees this woman who has her face covered, he assumes that she's a prostitute, and he asks to sleep with, and she asks her to sleep with him. Well, they strike a deal for the payment that Judah says he's going to deliver on later, and so Tamar asks for something to hold on to as collateral until he can pay up. And so she asks for his staff and his seal. So when you think about a seal, imagine like a signet ring. This ring, personalized ring that Judah used to uniquely mark or stamp his property or his communications with. They did this a lot in the ancient world. So Judah agrees, and he gives this woman those possessions of his. So they sleep together. Tamar becomes pregnant, but Judah just still remains clueless. And when Judah sends someone to repay his debt to this woman and to retrieve what he has left as collateral, the woman's disappeared. They can't find her. And so he just keeps quiet about the whole thing. Well, eventually, Tamar, who's gone back to living basically as an enslaved widow, starts to show. And one day, Judah is told that Tamar has prostituted herself in some way, violating the terms Judah had placed on her, and she's become pregnant. So Judah is incredibly offended. He orders that Tamar be brought before him and burned to death. And as she was brought out before him, Judah declares, as she was brought before Judah, Tamar declares, "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," and shows him the seal and shows him the staff. And so at this point, Judah's stuck, because he either has to admit his own guilt, or two, he has to remain quiet about it and kill his only potential heir, which again, in the ancient world, carrying on one's bloodline was everything, and Judah hadn't been able to do that yet. And so he ends up admitting his guilt. The truth is revealed, and Tamar gives birth to twin boys. Now, here's where things get a little bit even more interesting. Rendsburg argues that this story is presented this way in Genesis, not simply to recount an ancient story from Israel's past, but rather to offer commentary on an event that was happening in the author's current day and age, that would speak to the state of the monarchy at the height of its prominence. And in this particular case, point toward a scandalous story from the life of King David, who undoubtedly was the centerpiece of Israel's monarchy history. Many of you may be familiar with this story, where King David sees a woman bathing on a rooftop who was not his wife, who was in fact married to another man named Uriah. Well, King David decides he wants her for himself, and so he sends for her, has her brought to him, and uses his power to sleep with her, most likely against her will. And she becomes pregnant, and then King David devises a scheme to have her husband, Uriah, killed. Now, I'm not going to try to walk through all the different details of David's life that we find in the scriptures, because we simply just don't have the time for that. But Rendsburg points out some very interesting parallels between these two stories. Now, in these two stories, we have the unjust sexual exploit of Judah and the unjust sexual exploit of David, who was famously promoted as being from the line of Judah. He was a Judahite. And we also know from the stories that both David and Judah were shepherds. Additionally, as part of their individual stories, David and Judah each separate from their families to go to the town of Adullam. Now, another interesting parallel. In the first story, remember, Judah's wife isn't named. Rather, she's called the daughter of Shua, which in Hebrew is the word Bathshua, which is very close to the Hebrew for Bathsheba, which is Bathsheba. Pete Enns points out that it's almost like if you're telling a bedtime story to a child named Annie, and you start off by saying, once upon a time, there was a Princess Anna. And they were like, hey, Anna sounds like Annie. That sounds like my name. And you think to yourself, exactly, now I've got your attention. Now, if you prefer later biblical authors' take, though, later on in the book of Chronicles, when they refer back to both the daughter of Shua and Bathsheba in their genealogies, the author uses the same Hebrew word to name them both, Bathshua, to name both Bathsheba and the daughter of Shua. So this later biblical author seems to be making the very same connection between the two. Some more interesting parallels, though. David has a friend named Hiram that appears in multiple accounts, and Judah has a friend named Hira in the story. Again, one letter difference. It's like this winking that keeps taking place in the storytelling. Judah and David both have a Tamar in their lives. In Judah's case, it was his daughter-in-law. In David's case, he had a daughter named Tamar. And in both cases, The protagonist in the story commits a major act of sexual injustice and is forced to admit his guilt publicly. All of these details and parallels get included in this one short story of Judah and Tamar that gets abruptly inserted into this narrative in Genesis. And so the question worth wrestling with is, could anyone living in the height of the monarchy in the days of King David read this story of Judah and Tamar without also seeing the present day David and Bathsheba scandal in the text? Now, you obviously get to make up your own mind about that. We all do. But I find it rather compelling. But even if you are persuaded by that evidence, a big question that lingers out there still would be, well, what is the author trying to do in making these parallels? I mean, one take could be that the author is critiquing David and he's condemning his behavior. He's not using his name, and just like the Crucible or MASH, he's using this older story as a subtle shield for his critique. And he's letting the readers draw their own conclusions. But this is his creative way of critiquing the king at the time. Or another take could be that as a supporter of King David, it's his way of saying, look, all right, we all know David isn't a saint, just like Judah wasn't a saint. This is just what happens with people in power. And you know what? You just got to accept it. After all, look at how God is otherwise using him. Same way God used Judah, God's continuing to use David. And it's the author's way of at least naming the scandal, but really not holding David accountable for it. But I mean, that's something that would probably only happen in politics like 3,000 years ago, right? I mean, certainly not something that we'd see today. Now, there's a ton more examples that Rendsburg gets into of how the stories in Genesis are serving as a way for the author to speak to the times that he currently finds himself in. And I don't have time to get into all of those, but in the spirit of this teaching series that we've been in, True Fictions, I also want to make clear what's not at stake here is how historically accurate some of these stories of the patriarchs are or aren't in Genesis. Yet still, from a purely literary standpoint, they probably work better if at least some of the characters were known figures passed down through oral traditions of the Israelites. Just as Arthur Miller's play works better because the Salem witch trials was an actual event from history. And the Korean War actually did happen when it came to the setting for MASH. That's part of what makes them work so well. But again, their historical accuracy really isn't the point. Rather, what I find extremely interesting is how authors were using stories of the past to speak into and to critique and to draw parallels to the circumstances that they were living in right then in the present. And we say all the time, when it comes to the Bible, that what was written down had to speak to the original people it was being written for and their particular time and place in history. And that works for letters that we find in the New Testament, and that works for books like Genesis that we find in the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, why would I share all this with you today? Which, again, is basically graduate school level work on the Bible. Besides it just being interesting. Besides just being, you know what? I never knew to even consider that before. Why should I even care? I mean, what does this have to do with our life today other than saying, oh, that's some interesting stuff? Well, here's why. It's because I just want us to be reminded that the authors who wrote the Bible were constantly asking, even in a book like Genesis, full of all sorts of ancient stories and poems and historical accounts and mythologies, they were constantly asking, what is it that God is up to now in our present reality? And how do we speak into that? Because you see, I think that's the same invitation for you and I today. But far too often, people's faith consists of trying to defend, well, did this particular story or event from the ancient past literally happen or not? Where their faith ends up getting lived out in a way where it's all about the past, defending their particular interpretation of words that were written thousands of years ago, standing up for those words and fighting others over those words and their interpretations of those words, all along in their mind, thinking that they're honoring God in that, but doing it in ways that frankly look and sound nothing like Jesus, and completely ignore the actual people in real circumstances right in front of them at the present moment. It's almost as if many people have a faith that is centered around a God that stopped speaking nearly 2,000 years ago at the conclusion of the last book written in the Bible, and that God hasn't had anything else relevant to say to particular contexts, cultures, or people since then. Friends, that's not an active, living, relevant faith. It's not faith in a living Christ. And yet it's good for us to be reminded, wait, that's not even the tradition that we're actually a part of. Because what we discover in the Bible is that we're part of a long line of people who ask questions like, what does equality and justice look like now, today, in these particular circumstances of our world? What does it look like to include and care and stand up for those marginalized by oppressive and religious and political systems and institutions and voices today, in our time, in our nation, in our world? What does it look like to lovingly and boldly and creatively critique and speak truth to powers that abuse their positions of powers and positions of influence for self-interest that cause harm to vulnerable people today in the 21st century? What does it look like to love and show up and serve people right now in our world this week, this year? What does it look like to communicate their inherent worth and value to them in this particular moment of our world? Ask questions like, what does generosity look like in our context today in 2021? What does kindness look like in this moment, in this situation? I mean, what good does it do us to approach a story like Judah and Tamar in the book of Genesis and have our most passionate religious discussions and arguments be around whether or not it all literally happened or not, just like it was written? I mean, think about it. What good does that actually accomplish, really? Regardless if you could ever prove it one way or the other. Wouldn't it be a far better use of our time to ask questions like, what about this ancient story should inform how we think today? What if it was being used to critique specific events or even excuse those specific events in the 10th century? And if so, I wonder in what ways are we excusing the mistreatment and abuse of women at the hands of men in powerful positions today? And what does it look like for us to wisely speak out against it? Or in what ways would we find ourselves maybe excusing it in the name of financial progress or the advancement of our preferred political agendas? You see, those are questions for someone that's trying to figure out what it looks like to live out the way and kingdom of Jesus in this world today, in the here and now. And so, friends, my hope is that all this today would remind us that when sometimes we're tempted to just throw the Bible out because of how we've seen it been weaponized against other people that we care about, how it's been weaponized against us, some of us, in so many painful ways through the years, and we're tempted to just kind of dismiss it, that we would be reminded that within it are actually some pretty amazing writers trying to figure out how to speak into their particular time and circumstances, and that it's possible that we may actually find ourselves being inspired in ways that we didn't necessarily think about before, about how we can live out this same tradition in this same way of following God and following Christ in our world today. But more importantly, may it remind us that as we seek to follow Jesus and pattern our lives, and pattern how we live our lives by trying to live out this core truth of love your neighbor as yourself, that we will spend the greatest amount of our time and energy trying to figure out what it looks like to live that heart out now, in our culture, in our context today. Not trying to argue about what it was or what it wasn't like in some idealized past, trying to anticipate all of the what ifs of the future, but instead living out love and grace and kindness and truth and justice and generosity with the stories of our lives now. And letting those stories get passed on to others so that they too can wrestle with what it looks like to live out the way of Jesus in their specific time and place. So here's to living and loving well here and now, Crosspoint. Have a great week.
Thank you for joining us today, and welcome home. If you are in need of assistance during this crisis, please reach out at crosspoint.org/help.